Good morning, family. Um, got a got a call from one of my good brothers recently, and we had a very interesting conversation that I thought was pretty dope. It definitely gave me some measure of insight concerning what God's earlier evidence of like His mercy and grace, in Genesis. And it pretty much was trickled by a question. He actually asked me a couple of questions. I can't remember them all, but I do remember one in particular that I thought kind of stuck out. And essentially that question was about Cain and Abel. And the question that he asked specifically that kind of sparked this conversation was, why wasn't Cain's gift acceptable to God? And so in the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis, Cain and Abel were born to Adam and Eve, and the scriptures teach us that Cain and Abel brought sacrifices to the Lord, they brought offerings to the Lord, and Abel's offering was acceptable, but Cain's wasn't. And so I pretty much looked in the scripture, and I couldn't necessarily find anything that spoke specifically as to why Cain's offering wasn't acceptable. But I definitely noticed something about God in that particular text. So I'm just going to read a brief portion of the scripture, which starts at Genesis 4, verse 1. And it's pretty much just like a brief history of like Cain and Abel. So it says, I'm reading the Amplified version. So it says, now the man Adam knew Eve as his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have obtained a man, baby boy or son, with the help of the Lord. And later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept the flock of sheep and goats, but Cain cultivated the ground. And in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord as an offering of the fruit of the ground, but Abel brought an offering of the finest firstborn, and his flock the fat portion. And the Lord had respect or regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no respect. So Cain became extremely angry, and he looked annoyed and hostile. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you so angry? Why do you look annoyed? If you do well, believing me and doing what is acceptable and pleasing to me, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, but ignore my instructions, sin crouches at your door. Its desire is for you to overpower you, but you must master it. So I thought that was a dope display of like communication on God's behalf with his children. And again, in no way do we get the exact reason why Cain's offering was not accepted or respected, as this Amplified version put it. I even like did like a Google search, looked at some interesting results or whatever, and even like some of the latest scriptures on in the text. Hebrews teaches us that through faith that we believe that Abel's sacrifice was much more, acceptable in God's sight. So there isn't necessarily anything that speaks specifically as to why Cain's sacrifice wasn't acceptable in God's sight. But what I love about the text is the fact that when God addresses Cain, you can see that God was attentive. He had essentially let Cain know that his sacrifice wasn't acceptable by whatever means of communication that they had. But I love the fact that God was paying attention. I love the fact that God noticed that Cain wasn't in a good place. He noticed that Cain was irritable. He was annoyed. He had some measure of hostility in him. It can be easy to look at the situation and just focus on the fact that Abel was right. But I love the fact that God noticed that Cain was bothered by the situation. And I think maybe I relate to that on a personal level, just being, honest about, like, the times in my life where I had good intention, but I didn't necessarily pull off whatever it was that was expected of me, and found a way to be angry or bothered by the fact that my intention wasn't received, rather than the fact that my behavior wasn't what was expected of me. And I think that that's the case here with Cain. I think Cain was in this place of where he kind of took God's kindness for granted. I think Cain was in this position where he just assumed that whatever he wanted to do was right, because he was still maybe, following God's instruction, and he probably had it in his heart to do the right thing, or maybe he didn't. We don't know specifically, but what I do know about the dynamic of that relationship is that, first off, God showed up. That's number one, right? And so the scriptures show us that Abel's sacrifice was acceptable and Cain's wasn't, right? So that means that there had to have been some measure of system where they had done this before. That this is not the first time that they're offering, right? And how do we know that? We know that by God's response. God's response to Cain's frustration and his hostility. And God says to him in kindness and in love, like, yo, why are you annoyed? Why are you frustrated? Why are you behaving this way? Right? Like, if you do good, would I not receive you? So that alone teaches me that they have been here before. And there may have been a time where there was a time when Cain's gifts were acceptable. This is not God being unreasonable or unfair because, he just can decide, to be rude or tough or what's good or what's not. Like, God is still God regardless of whether or not we agree with his methods or his understanding. But in this particular moment, God is actually comforting someone who did something wrong. You know what I'm saying? Like, God is simply saying, like, yo, he cares enough to notice that your attitude has shifted. He cares enough to know that you are bothered, or he cared enough to know that Cain was bothered in this particular moment. But he doesn't necessarily give him an excuse, or he doesn't necessarily find a way to just accept that Cain did whatever he did half-heartedly or not to the specifications that was previously given to him. Like, the Lord simply doubles down and says, like, yo, if you do not do right, will I not accept you? So that shows me that Cain had an awareness of what was expected of him, right? That's the point. The point is there was an expectation from Cain that he didn't meet, and he got chastised for it, and he felt the way about it. And even though he felt the way about it, it wasn't like God was being unreasonable. God was letting him know, like, yo, bro, I have a particular standard. This is not your first rodeo, right? Like, we've been here before. And every other time you got it right, and every time you get it right, I am accepting of you. God didn't come with the fire and brimstone. God didn't come with the wrath of thunder and the hammer of justice, right? Like, he came with loving kindness, and he was explaining to his son, like, yo, man, just do it the way I tell you to do it. Just be right, right? But the other part about that I thought was dope was the fact that God also is warning him that, yo, man, there is something brewing in you, or at the very least, there is something that is close to you that is not right. The Lord let him know, like, yo, sin is at the door of your heart. Like, you are on the edge of engaging in this line of behavior that's not acceptable. And it's beginning to permeate every area of your life. And the fact that God gives him understanding about that shows how gracious the Lord is and how kind he is, because not only is he comforting someone who did something wrong, who, depending on the viewpoint, you can look at and say deserved punishment or deserved some measure of rebuke or reproach, God is encouraging him to not stay in this stuck place. Like, yo, you messed up, but that's okay. Just do the right thing and you'll find acceptance from me, right? And I love that because I identify with that. I think we all identify with the fact that we have done things that may have been intended to be good, but ended up falling flat, right? But I love the fact that God has even taken it a step further, and he's getting to the root of the issue. And the root of the issue would appear to be that, there is sin there. There is something that is causing a separation between you and I. And that separation desires to overtake you. It's such a big thing that it is beginning to permeate every area of your life, even the area that I gave you specific instructions and told you to follow explicitly. And we know that because God has already shown through his conversation that if you do what I tell you to do, if you do what I put on your heart and on your shoulders to do, through way of my guidance and instructions, will you not be accepted? This means that God has shown him. They have already had a relationship. There is proof there that God is merciful, kind, and accepting. He is not so unfair that he put a standard on him that he couldn't meet. God gave him a measurable standard to meet, and he's been meeting it. But for whatever reason, he is now begin to drift away from that. He is now begin to fall away, and God is correcting him for it in an attempt to save him, in an attempt to prevent him from continuing on this way. So I love the fact that the Lord lets him know what the issue is, which is sin. There's sin there. And if you are not, the sin, he's also explaining the intention of the sin. He's also explaining how sin works, right? It comes with the intention and the goal to overtake you. God is letting Cain know from the beginning, like, there is this thing that you are experiencing, that you are being faced with on an emotional level, on a heart level, on a spiritual level, is not come to play with you. It has not come here to be friends and aid you in your fellowship with me. It has come to overtake you. This lets us know that you cannot play with sin. This is not simply like a casual warning. This is God letting Cain know, like, yo, bro, this is a big thing. This thing that you are wrestling with, this thing that you have been dabbling in, or this thing that has put you at odds with me is such a strong force that if you are not careful, it will ruin and overtake every area of your life. But the beauty of that prognosis is the fact that God says to him, but you must overcome it. God is letting him know that you can do it. You can get past this thing. This thing doesn't have dominion over you. And if you would just master that, if you would just control that thing, if you would, whether it was his anger or his slothfulness and being dejected as a result of him not being, it could be a myriad of things, right? We don't know. All we know is that God saw it and God spoke to it. God gave him the wisdom to control and confront the thing that is making him undesirable or not acceptable in God's sight. And so, of course, on a personal level, I appreciate that, because I think a lot of times we as children of God, we lean too heavy on our intention. We lean too heavy on how much we mean well. And we use it as an excuse, as a get out of jail free card to not change, to not bring about or institute some measure of growth from a spiritual perspective. And I believe I have mentioned that in one of my other videos when, in regards to like staying stuck in my feelings when my feelings are contrary to the growth that God is trying to change in my life, right? But I am definitely one of those individuals who rest comfortably in intention. And what I'm learning is that your intention is not good enough. There has to be productivity by way of behavior, right? The Bible says there's a way that seems right to a man, but it leads to death. And that is like, bro, that's one of those scriptures that I live by, because I'm always about being good intentionally. And I think it's good to have this measure of intentionality about your behavior and putting your best foot forward. But we cannot ignore that regardless of how much we intend to be good, there is still an expectation to perform the way that God has ordained for us to perform, the way that the scriptures teach us that we must perform. There is a standard that God holds on all of his children's lives that he doesn't play with. And I'm not mad at him for not playing with it, because he really does love us, right? Like, he really does have a desire for us to grow and mature He really does have a desire for us to get to this place where we're in complete fellowship with him, and it is indicative in our behavior. On top of the fact that if you don't get it right, not only are there consequences for you, but there are consequences for people you are connected to. Like, we can't keep saying sorry as a result of hurting people because we meant well and just chalk it up to, well, I meant well, right? Like, there has to be some measure of accountability for us when we are not in the proper position. We can't keep using intention as a means to excuse our behavior or our lack of growth. There has to be some measure of accountability where we acknowledge that we did something wrong. And the beauty of it is just like what God said to Cain, like, yo, if you do right, will I not accept you, right? Like, God is not some cruel tyrant who doesn't want us to grow and mature. He understands that mistakes are part of the progress, the process, right? But it's something about being defiant in that place where intention is what you use to justify your behavior. And that's where Cain got it wrong. I would imagine he was under the impression that doing what he was doing was okay, despite the fact that he already had previous instruction of God's expectation. You can't substitute God's instructions for your intention. If there is direction, there is instruction, then God expects us to follow that. And I thank him for his mercy that we can ask for forgiveness whenever we've done something wrong. But it's like, nah, bro, you can't allow sin to romanticize your efforts through your intention and use it as a legal way to get out of whatever it is that God put on your head to do. That's one of the reasons why Cain fell, because sin is beguiling. It is so smooth in a way that it gets you to be disobedient through you believing that what you're doing is right instead of what God told you is right. I also feel like that's one of the ways that Cain got it wrong, right? Like, he somehow allowed himself to believe that this is what I'll offer instead of whatever specification that God said. And that's what sin does. It manipulates your mind, your thought. It manipulates the way you see things. And rather than be obedient, completely obedient to God, you find a way to justify doing it on your own or doing it the way you see fit, not realizing that you're stepping out of the will of God. So I thank God for his patience and his kindness. I thank the Lord for loving Cain enough. I think that was the biggest revelation for me throughout this whole story, this whole ordeal, was that God loved Cain. I think when I was younger, reading that story, it always made me feel like, man, like Cain got a raw deal. And that's just from like immature eyes or whatever the case may be. I even remember getting older and being so disturbed by Cain's vicious wrath against his brother that he killed his brother, all because he got it wrong with the Lord and felt the way about how his brother was accepted. There was some measure of jealousy. And my homeboy that I was talking to, my good brother, that when we was talking about this, man, he definitely raised an interesting point. And one of the things that he said about that was there must have been some measure of, like, not necessarily tension, but there must have been something in Cain's heart where he may have had an issue with his brother previously. Because how do you go from growing with your brother at one point in life is life to one particular scenario of you offering and your offering not being accepted and you being so mad at your brother over it that you kill your brother? And so my homeboy was just like, yo, there must have been an issue, beforehand. And like, yeah, there probably was normal sibling rivalry or whatever the case may be, especially when you're the older brother and you believe you got it together, you know what I'm saying? And then you see your little brother doing it better than you. I'm pretty sure there was some measure of jealousy. I'm pretty sure there was something there because the Lord already let him know, like, yo, sin is at your heart and it desires to overtake you. And if it's not careful, if you're not careful, it'll overtake you, but you must master it. Like, God is letting him know, like, yo, bro, you have an issue with your anger or whatever it is that you're wrestling with. And if you're not careful, you're going to be consumed by it. And then we see in later verses that he was so consumed by his sinfulness that he indeed actually killed his brother behind it. You know what I'm saying? It's definitely a travesty to even know that he could be so mad at his brother that he would kill his brother behind something he did wrong. And even in that, God still loved him, still cared for him. But because God is a God of justice, he pronounced judgment on him. You know what I'm saying? And so one of the things that the Lord said to him was like, yo, you're in verse 11. Well, actually, in verse 10, it says, the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's innocent blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you, which basically means like producing crops. You shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the land, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a fugitive and aimless, and a fugitive, a vagabond on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And this is the part that's like, man, here we go again with God's goodness. And the Lord said, therefore, whoever kills Cain, a sevenfold vengeance, that is punishment 7 times worse, shall be taken on him. And the Lord set a protective mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. Like, yo, bro, look at how awesome God is. Despite the fact that this man killed his brother, offered up sacrifices that wasn't acceptable to God, and had the nerve to be angry about it, had the nerve to have an attitude about it. And even when God pronounced judgment on him, he said to the Lord that the judgment was too great, and God decided to still show mercy by putting a mark on him that will prevent other people from seeing him and desiring to kill him for whatever reason that may be. Maybe that during that time period, people were lawless, particularly lawless, and didn't care who they hurt or offended. You know what I'm saying? But the fact that God still, even in judgment, gave him a measure of protection just speaks to the goodness of God. Like, you can tell that God actually loved this man despite his sinfulness. And I think that's the part that speaks volumes to me. I think that's the part that shows me that despite how much we get it wrong, God is kind, God is caring. He's in the middle of that situation trying to point you towards the right way. And even after you do wrong, you will have to face some measure of judgment and punishment because God is a just God, right? Like, just because he's kind and merciful does not mean you get to escape judgment. It does not mean that there isn't some measure of penalty for your sinfulness, especially when God warned you about it, right? So we see judgment on Cain, but there is still this measure of protection that God gave him that he wasn't worthy of. And I love that about God because I can't honestly find a reason that God should be protective over my life. I may not have killed my brother like Cain, but it doesn't mean that my sin doesn't have consequences. It doesn't mean that my sin doesn't carry a price. And yet and still, despite the blood crying out from the ground to God, God still put a measure of protection over Cain so that people wouldn't kill him. He had to live out a particular sentence of wandering from place to place and not being the farmer that he used to be, who was particularly skilled and great in what he did when it came to cultivation. But there was still mercy there. There was still mercy there. God didn't treat him the way that he treated his brother. And so I love that. It just speaks volumes about God's mercy and grace. All these years I've read this story, and I think the part that I've always missed is the fact that God loved Cain. Like, he actually loved Cain. And I believe that wholeheartedly. I don't know why I'm so surprised, but I think over the years I just focused so much on his sinfulness and the judgment pronounced on him that I missed the major part. And I think that was the fact that the Lord loved him. It reminds me of just how good God has been to me and how much I may have done things to have people pronounce judgment over my life. I think it reminds me of the fact that there may have been a point in my life where I was probably deserving and still am deserving of God's harsh judgment, yet I am the recipient of his mercy and his grace, and most importantly, his salvation. So I just wanted to share that with you guys. It blessed my heart to know that even in the mess, even in the dark side of life, God's love still permeates and radiates and shines through. I wish Cain wouldn't have done what he did, but he made his mistake. He did what he did, and God still loved him despite his his errors. And I'm motivated and encouraged by that. It shows me that there's always salvation. There's always redemption. You know what I'm saying? And that's just based on God's mercy and grace. But in any event, thank you for listening. I hope this helps. Peace.